Thank you very much, Kent. Ladies and gentlemen, a pleasure to be here in Colorado. I'm going to speak on two aspects of thresholds. First, I'm going to speak about some material information that became available in Canada relative to methamphetamine. And it's quite interesting. And I've called it Canadian Environmental Methamphetamine Identifications Linked to a Horse Trailer. One of the problems with postulating an environmental source for a substance is it helps if you can show clearly how it got there, and very often you can't. It turns out in this case that we can, and I'm going to walk you through it because it's because it leads to, and I have proposed and submitted for publication, an environmental regulatory threshold for methamphetamine in Europe. I think it's going to be published. It's under review at the moment. There have been, in the last year, 8 low-concentration urinary methamphetamine identifications in Canada in 2014 involving 3 trailers. Half of these have occurred as what I call a cluster. They're closely associated in time and place, which suggests a triggering event in that particular location. One cluster of 3 positives in 48 hours, in a 48-hour period, were linked to a methamphetamine identified trailer, contaminated trailer. That establishes clearly methamphetamine as a potential environmental contaminant in racing horses, and I've suggested a cutoff for methamphetamine in the low nanogram per ml range in urine, just like we've had for caffeine for a long time. Kent did that work initially in Florida. We adopted the human one into horses for benzoylecgonine, cocaine, and we have one for morphine that was actually picked up, believe it or not, by the British Jockey Club, the British Horse Racing Authority, in the early 2000s. What is methamphetamine? Methamphetamine is a CNS stimulant and a controlled substance in Canada and the US. There's something quite interesting about methamphetamine I'm going to show you. It exists in 2 forms. There's a D form, the right-handed form, and an L form, the left-handed form, and one of those is much more pharmacologically active than the other. Now, for a long time, ELISA testing was the screening method for methamphetamine, and that would have been in I would call it initially the low nanogram, 10 nanograms per ml, in that range, which is, by current standards, relatively high. We can now detect down to 50 picograms. It's about 1,000 times more sensitive. And since meth is widely used by humans, inadvertent environmental exposure of horses is likely to occur, and given current technology, may be very easily detectable. Those are the 2 structures of methamphetamine, and if you look at let's see, can I get this arrow to work? If you look at this methyl group here, you'll see that the structure is slightly different in those 2, and the orientation of that methyl group is different between the D and the L, and that has a considerable influence on both the pharmacological effects of the drug and where you can buy it, because apparently you can buy the L-methamphetamine over the counter as Vicks Vapo Inhaler, just so that you know that. That came as a surprise to me, but that's what I hear. How much methamphetamine do you find in horse urine after you've dosed a horse? Here we have some data. Richard Ray, and that's going way back to the early 70s at Ohio State University, dosed a number of horses, and I actually plotted this in my book that I published in the 80s, and you've got an average concentration of 7,000 nanograms per ml in urine after 150 milligrams intramuscularly. So that's a pretty high concentration in urine after what we assume is an effective pharmacological dose. And the concentrations in plasma are much lower, as you can see there. Now, the story that I'm going to tell, and I shouldn't have used the word story, because I used that to a judge once, and he stopped me immediately. He doesn't want to hear a story, he wants to hear facts. So the facts are, we'll use it like this. A lady in Michigan was purchased a large horse trailer to ship some horses to race at Ajax Downs in Toronto. And she put the horses in the trailer, 3 horses in the trailer, shipped them to Ajax Downs, so they were exposed in the horse to the trailer for about 6 or 8 hours for the trip from Michigan to Toronto. They raced in the next couple of days. She had 3 horses were tested on the 13th and 14th, and all tested positive for traces of methamphetamine. And these, I'll give you the actual concentrations, are classic low concentration urinary positives, and this is a classic cluster. You have a sequence of events, you have horses associated with going through these events, all reacting exactly the same. And when the Racing Commission, the Ontario Racing Commission, came to interview the lady, and they interviewed all her people, and I read the various transcripts, they considered that she did not know where this came from, and they took a number of samples from her setup, including a swab of the trailer. The swab of the trailer turned up positive for methamphetamine at 22 nanograms per milligram, and I believe they took it from the manger area of the trailer. And I asked the lady, does she have a picture of the trailer? And there's the actual trailer itself. What would be the association between a horse trailer and methamphetamine? If you are synthesizing methamphetamine, if you have an illicit methamphetamine synthesis lab, you will want to have it mobile and quite well hidden and be able to move it around just in case people wonder what the heck is going on in your backyard. And we don't know for sure, but that is one possible hypothesis to explain the association. These are the concentrations in the urine samples of the 3 horses. 56, those are 056 nanograms, that's 56 picograms per ml, 200 picograms per ml, 340 picograms per ml, presumably associated with the environmental exposure. The lady had a second trailer, and she had a horse out of the second trailer that was not exposed to the methamphetamine trailer, went and raced in Toronto, raced 1, was tested negative. So we, believe it or not, we have a negative control in this system, which is good experimental design, to say the least. If you calculate the dose to produce the methamphetamine positive, it is the lowest one, I believe, is 1/150,000th of the clinical dose that I just gave you to yield the threshold, to yield the lowest identification. So the amounts of methamphetamine that the horse has to be exposed to produce these very low concentration positives are extremely small indeed, and if you reduce the dose 150,000-fold, you ain't going to get a pharmacological effect. It's between 15,000 and 150,000, so there's no possibility of a pharmacological effect. There have been a number of other positives in Canada. Let me talk about the Saskatoon ones first. A lady had 2 positives associated on August the 30th again in Saskatoon. We don't have the concentrations because she only did a split on 1 of them, and then she had another on September 12th. She had 1.2 nanograms per ml. So we're talking about in the nanogram concentration for these. And we have 2 other positives in Toronto, 200 picograms per ml, 1.75 nanograms per ml, and 0.2 nanograms per ml. So altogether in Canada, we have 8 low concentration methamphetamine positives. 2 of them, half of them, 3 in the Ajax Downs situation, and 2 in the Saskatoon occurred as clusters, so more than half of them occurred as clusters in association. Concentrations are all quite low, and I believe these are entirely consistent with environmental exposure, and the concentrations are sufficiently low that they're not going to be associated in any way with a pharmacological a significant effect on the performance of the horse at the time of the race in question. And basically, I have just told you what's in the summary sheet here, and I have suggested that we have an interim cutoff, and I believe, if I recall correctly, I suggested 10 nanograms per ml. When you set a cutoff for an environmental substance, there's no pharmacological rule. You look at what's occurring in the environment, and you look at where pharmacology occurs, and you set your cutoff high enough to cover what you think is going to be environmental exposure. It's a judgment call, and I suggested an interim one of 10 nanograms per ml in urine to cover these situations. That is the methamphetamine situation. If I have a few minutes, I'll go ahead and present another little situation that we dealt with in the spring, and this one in Washington State. This is a situation that was brought to me by Mary Ann, the RMTC Xylazine threshold. And this is revisiting the Xylazine guidelines, the RMTC Xylazine guidelines, and I got some Australian assistance, and I have put in Dr. Glenys K. Noble from Wagga Wagga University in, I believe, Victoria, Australia, as the senior author, because she was interested in getting credit for her work, and I was very happy to do that. I also changed the title slightly. I was going to say likely helps to have actual data before setting a threshold was my original title, but when I put Glenys on there, I backed off, and I thought I'll make it more conservative, it would look better on her Viva, and she won't look like she's poking fun at anybody. Now, before we go anywhere with this situation, I want to draw attention to this particular slide that Rick Savage showed to us, this group, years ago. This is an administration of about 500 milligrams, half a gram, of boldenone equipoise to 20 horses in the RMTC study. And you can see it peaking at 10,000 picograms, which is 1 nanogram per ml. But what is compelling about this is that it trickles on for 150 days. So the take-home message for everybody in this room, including myself, is if you put 500 milligrams of a drug, and we're talking ballpark round figures now, into any animal, and if you trickle it out slow enough, you'll detect it. It could be detected for 150 days. It just depends on the speed at which it's dropped out into the horse and moved out of the horse. And if it's very, very slow, it can be an extremely long period indeed. That's the take-home message from this slide. And the terminal plasma half-life, the time for the concentration to drop by half in this slide is about 15 days, which is very long. And from that figure, you can make various estimates. So now, just with that in mind, we're going to go to Xylazine. With Xylazine, we're going to give just about the same number of milligrams. We're actually going to give twice the number of molecules because it's a much smaller molecule. But ballpark, we're talking about the same number of molecules going into the horse as this time as an IV injection. Boldenone goes into the muscle as a depot preparation and is structured to be trickled out and give you that very long half-life. But Xylazine is put in as what's called a bolus, and it goes as a glob into the jugular vein and distributes and hits the brain within minutes. The dose, as I said, is about up to 500 milligrams, and sometimes you'll give less. If you're a clinician, you'll probably give less, and I'll show you why. It's given as a rapid IV bolus. You pop it right in, and you want to get it in the brain as fast as you can. And what it does is it hits the brain, it diffuses, it's very lipid soluble. That's another thing to remember about a drug. But it's very lipid soluble, and it has to be. It gets into the brain immediately and produces the effect. And the question then for the regulator is what is the terminal half-life after it goes through the distribution process? How fast is it eliminated? What is the terminal plasma half-life? That's the question. Now, it turns out with Xylazine that it's very, very easy to follow the pharmacological effect. If I had a horse here in front of you, and if I put Xylazine into the vein, the horse would just droop like that, and you could get your Walmart measuring tape and measure the distance between the nose of the horse and the floor, and that gives you the pharmacological response. And I will never forget, I started as a biochemical pharmacologist, and I had to make molecules to do things, and I discovered that certain pharmacologists could use a measuring tape to get a pharmacological response and publish it, and I added that to my list of things I could do. And you can see here, on the lower curve, that's the distance between the nose of the horse and the floor, and immediately after you give the drug, the horse droops, the nose comes almost down to the floor, and then as the drug diffuses back out of the brain, the horse comes back to normal. That's very helpful for a veterinarian. The horse is completely relaxed. In fact, he won't give that dose because he wants to give it a smaller dose because he doesn't want it quite that relaxed. But that's the duration of the pharmacological effect. Now the question is, what happens to the drug after it has come out of the brain of the horse and is going through the distribution and elimination phase? Because what the chemist is seeing is, what the chemist wants to know is what the concentration is at 48 hours after the administration. And you go to the literature, you don't get much help. This is a curve that we plotted, and you show it dropping very, very rapidly, and then about 1.5 hours, it's relatively low, but you can see that the curve is flattening out. And here is another curve, this may be the same data, and the curve has flattened out, and we see this relatively slow decay out to about 5 to 6 hours, so 5 hours. Now the question is, we didn't have data that I was aware of when Marianne called me. We didn't have any data beyond that. So what I did was I went to the back up. Here's what the RMTC has. Xylazine, they have a threshold, 10 picograms, that's 0.1 nanogram, 10 picograms per milliliter of plasma or serum. They have a time, 48 hours. They have a dose, a route intravenous. They have no dose whatsoever. Reference notes, no reference notes whatsoever. They have a note that says we're going to see xylazine, so that's what we're going to call the positive on. So what they're saying is, if you see more than 10 picograms of xylazine in the plasma at 48 hours, you're in trouble. That's the RMTC rule. Now, just looking at that, they haven't got a dose. That is extremely unusual, and it suggests to me that the word I think I have on the next slide is, it's a WBG statement, we be guessing statement. When the Americans were trying to win the what's the big yacht race? The America's Cup in Australia. They were calculating the formula for the sales, and they set up a company to do the sale calculations, and they called it WBG. We be guessing was when they were calculating the sales. I never forgot that. Okay, so Marianne calls me. We have a positive out here in Washington State. And the positive was at 0.09, was 97 picograms per ml. The Truesdale report came in above the threshold. The dose administered was 200 milligrams IV for a dental procedure, which wouldn't drop the nose down to the floor, but it would make the horse quite comfortable, and you'd be able to work with it 52 hours prior to post. So that would be outside the 48 hours, and would be actually a conservative, very good dose. The trainer has a 30-year clean record, got a $250 fine and a 7-day suspension, loss of purse. I reviewed the matter at Marianne's request, and I couldn't find any data showing us what the threshold, the concentrations were at 48 hours after this dose. So I went to the literature and I dug around the literature, and I pulled out a statement saying that the no effect threshold, a very conservative one, would be 76 picograms per ml, which would be 10 times the RMTC one. And I looked at the way he calculated it, and I improved the calculations, I thought. I'm quite happy defending that. And I suggested a threshold of 300 picograms per ml, and I sent that to Dr. Macomber. Okay. At the same time, I emailed Dr. Noble in Australia because I knew they had been working on xylazine, and actually I had been at a meeting and it may have been presented there. So I emailed her and says, hey, do you have any data? And she sent me back the data by return mail. And here is what came in. We have the plasma concentrations of xylazine. This is 400 milligrams per horse, and you can see them dropping relatively rapidly for the first 4 to 6 hours, just like we've seen in the previous data. But they've got points at 12 hours where the rate of decline of the plasma concentration of the drug has basically stopped. It looks pretty flat between 6 and 12 hours. Now, if you look at the next slide she has, it's even more interesting. She's got a combination of xylazine and butorphanol, and that's a commonly used combination. And you can see that once it hits 8 hours, the horse essentially the illumination slows down completely. Now, those are the only data that I am aware of on the face of the earth at the moment, but they clearly suggest that the RMTC threshold is a projected threshold from earlier data and does not take into account the fact that the terminal half-life appears to change after 6 to 8 hours both in xylazine alone and certainly in combination with butorphanol. So I sent the materials to Mary Ann, and I believe she communicated them with Dr. McCumber. The penalty was changed to a loss of purse. The Optus fine, no loss of purse, which I think was critical for the trainer, $1,500 fine and a 7-day suspension. The other thing that has happened is if you go to the Washington regulations, they have upped their threshold they have walked away from the RMTC threshold and they've gone up to 200.2 nanograms per ml. Now, I think it's still a WBG approach, but it's a much more conservative approach, much more likely to be closer to the through threshold than the previous one, and I assume it's being applied very cautiously. So that's the story. The take-home messages to veterinarians are to be very careful with xylazine close to racing, since the published thresholds, the one on the book, is that, shall we say, not well supported by published science. Be particularly careful if you're using it in combination with butorphanol, since based on the Wagga Wagga data, you may be at considerably increased risk of exceeding the plasma threshold. And we're working on getting communication on these matters submitted for publication as we speak. We have to thank particularly Dr. Glenys Noble, who they're a senior lecturer in equine science at Wagga Wagga University, Dr. Kimberly Brewer, who works with me on these projects, Kent, who always works with me on these projects and helps me, Mary Ann, Mary Ann helped me, first of all, alerted me, fed Dr. McCumber. I think she handled him very well, the circumstances. And then when I was getting ready to write this up, I wanted to know what the outcome for the veterinarians involved were. And I have a colleague in South America who I work closely with, and he translates some of my stuff into Spanish and publishes it, and that's very helpful indeed, so we acknowledge him. We did have, Dr. Waterman came in and cited a study. His study stopped at actually 3 hours, so his study didn't even go that far. And there's some unusual aspects of that study that I won't go into right now. Just in closing, to thank the HBPA, National HBPA, and all the regional HBPAs for their ongoing support, and particularly the National, the Florida HBPA, the Ohio Horsemen's Benevolent Protective Association, the Indiana Horsemen's, the Kentucky Horsemen's, the Iowa, and the HBPA of Ontario. And I should point out very clearly that it was Leslie Barker and Conrad Cohen in Ontario who alerted me first to the methamphetamine identifications and put me in touch with the young lady from Michigan who had the trailer situation. They were critical in getting that organized, and ongoing support from the Nebraska Horsemen's Benevolent Protective Association. I thank you very much indeed, and it's been a pleasure and very productive doing this work. Thank you very much indeed.